leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
There is one issue that is dominating the politics across the West at the moment, and it is immigration, both in the European Union and, of course, in America too. Oddly, on this second anniversary of us getting the result of the Brexit referendum, a result in which immigration played a massive, crucial part. Oddly, there's almost no debate in this country about immigration at all at the moment, but there is elsewhere. And perhaps symbolic of this are the 230 migrants involved in a standoff between Italy and the charities which rescued them from the waters off Libya. They're on board a boat called Lifeline. It's run by a German aid group. Neither Italy nor Malta will allow the boat to dock. And there's a crisis meeting in Brussels today. The official summit of European leaders does not take place until Thursday. That's one that Mrs May, of course, will be at. But there's a crisis meeting today taking place in Brussels, which has been boycotted by the Hungarians, by the Slovaks, by the Czechs, by the Hungarians. They've boycotted it because they're sick to death of being told they must take migrant quotas. And adding to their anger is Monsieur Macron, whose idea of EU reform is to centralise power even more greatly, and he wants to put a system in fines in place if people don't take their fair share as he sees it. Now, in many ways, the person that is leading this new rebellion is the Lega, the League, Italian political party's leader, Matteo Salvini. He's the Interior Minister. This is his latest comment on the migrant crisis.
My task is to defend the borders of this wonderful country, which cannot become a refugee camp. Therefore, those who have the right to enter Italy will enter Italy. For everyone else, there are Spanish harbours, French harbours, Maltese harbours, Dutch harbours.
So Italy has had enough, and, you know, you've got a new coalition between these two parties, the Five Star and the League, and they are now talking very tough on this subject. They've simply had enough. And in Germany, fascinatingly, Mrs Merkel, who has been the dominant European politician of the modern era, she has a problem because, remember, back in 2015, after Mr Juncker had launched the EU's migration policy, which basically was that if you come across the Mediterranean by whatever means and set foot on EU soil, basically you'll be allowed to stay. And I was fiercely critical of Juncker at that time in the European Parliament. I said it was a crazy policy that would play into the hands of the criminal trafficking organisations, that would risk people's lives. And I said at the time we should look at Australia, who faced a very similar problem with boats headed to Australia, people drowning, and the Australians said, look, we are not going to take a single refugee unless you've been processed somewhere else, and we've made that decision somewhere else, and the boats stopped coming and the drowning stopped. And Mrs Merkel, of course, compounded all of this by saying, we can cope. As many as want to come, and guess what? 1.4 million went to Germany, and it has totally changed German attitudes and German politics. It's led directly to the rise of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. They, in turn, putting massive pressure on the Bavarian Conservatives, who are known as the CSU, without whom Mrs Merkel can't govern. And the battle, really, that is going on inside the European Union is this. Should decisions about immigration, about how you deal with illegals, how you qualify or recognise refugees, should these decisions be taken by the European Union, or should these decisions be taken by nation states? And that really is at the heart of this whole debate. And unless Mrs Merkel somehow can satisfy her coalition partners in Bavaria, who incidentally are saying, we will not take anybody into Germany who's already been processed in another European country, which actually, if you go right the way back to the Geneva Convention on all of this, you know, was recognised for many years, to be fair, under international law. Unless unless somehow a compromise is found, Merkel will be gone, and there'll be fresh elections in Germany, and the AfD will get even stronger. And in America, of course, Trump has had, I think, it's been the hottest week in many ways since he became the president. A zero-tolerance policy on immigration, illegal immigration coming up through the Mexican border, and of course the policy of separating children and parents, leading to a huge outcry, leading to Trump saying, no, we're going to change that. Families will be kept together, but America is going to maintain its zero tolerance. We're not going to be a soft touch. What fascinates me is everybody is saying that Trump and America are cruel and heartless in the way in which they're dealing with this, but somehow the Europeans are soft and cuddly. Well, I don't think so, and let me tell you why. Last year, we know that 5,000 people drowned crossing the Mediterranean. The year before that, it was a similar number. Some estimates are that over 30,000 people have died in the last few years, trying to get into Europe. And I would actually argue that Trump's policy leads to far less human suffering than that of the European Union. I'm sure that, as a view, will provoke some debate. Steve is on the line from Hemel Hempstead. Good morning, Steve.
Hi, Nigel.
Hi there.
Hi. You asked the question whether Europe's got it right on immigration or Donald Trump.
Yes.
And the simple answer, 1,000%, is Donald Trump's got it right. This whole argument is based on the 2,000 children locked up and not being with their families, which I guess is not a nice thing.
Yep.
But what they don't tell you is the 63,000 Americans that have been killed in the last 15 years by illegal immigration, by illegal immigrants,
yes,
through drugs, through drink driving, etc. Now, that is over 10 times more people that have died in America in the last 15 years than died in Iraq and Afghanistan. To give you some idea. So
that is an amazing figure, Steve. I mean, I know that I know that Trump often parades with the families of those who've been murdered by illegal immigrants. I have to say, I don't know whether your figure's right or not. Clearly,
they are right.
Okay, fine, Steve.
They're right. I watched the programme, law enforcement officers, etc., all these victims. This is factual. This is factual figures.
Frankly, Steve, whether it is factual, whether it's much smaller, the point is this has been happening, and Trump has made that a political issue.
Yes.
But many, Steve, would say, and I'm hearing it, that Trump is a cold, heartless monster, and some. I mean, I listened to a BBC radio programme yesterday morning where somebody was commenting and saying, well, if you look at the language of Trump and his behaviour, and it's there in the Observer today, some suggesting that Trump may lead us to the next Holocaust.
Well, it's a shame that the BBC didn't worry a bit more about Jimmy Savile over the last 50 years. I mean, well, it's true. It's true. Okay. I mean, we all know what the BBC are like. I mean, I don't watch them anymore. I suggest the best thing we can do, because you've been talking about referendums this morning. Yep. And all that sort of stuff. No, I've got the solution to all this. It's a binary vote. We vote whether we want to keep open-door immigration in this country as it is, or we want to stop it by Now, let me. Now,
that'd be a good referendum, Steve, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I wonder what the answer would be.
Yeah, I think I know.
48-52,
no.
Maybe 80-20.
Well, 70-30 anyway. Steve, thank you. I'm going to move on. I'm going to go to Bill in Faversham. Good morning, Bill.
Hello there, Nigel. I'm genuinely getting confused with what the Western leaders in Europe want.
Yes.
Because if we were to actually, let's just go along with it. Let's drop all controls, all border controls, everything, and just let the poor people from the Sudan, who I don't blame, by the way, let them just come in their millions. Now, here's my question. In this country, we already cannot keep up with the house building that's required. There are homeless in all of those Western European countries. Do we draw the line at 10 million, 50 million, 100 million? Because there are hundreds of millions of people that, because of war and other displacements, would love to come to Europe.
Yeah, I mean, Bill,
where do we draw the line?
Bill, the UNHCR produced a figure that they estimated up to 60 million people were displaced through war or political oppression. So, I mean, it's literally impossible to deal with on that scale, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, nobody could deal with that. And in fact, here's the bizarre thing. If you were to follow this through to its logical conclusion, it would turn the Western European capitals into the very thing that people are running from.
Yes, and that's a cultural argument, Bill, that gets made. Those that make it, of course, get screamed at and called horrible names. No, look, Bill, I understand where you're coming from. Thank you. I'm going to rattle through a few calls here. David is calling from Uxbridge. Good morning, David.
Yeah, hi, Nigel. I think it's more complicated than saying it's either Macron or Trump.
David, of course it's always nuanced, but what I was trying to do was to show people that actually we think, the EU are nice and soft and cuddly, but actually their ridiculous policies are leading to many thousands drowning and being killed.
Sure, and partly agree with that, maybe for different. But I think the policies of somebody like Macron, who's an I would say, neoliberalist, globalist, actually causes both in his liberal intervention war policies and also the economic policies cause a lot of the problems both in the global south and at places like Africa and at home with a sort of precarity. You get like low skill, low-wage jobs, and then people in precarious, who do we blame? We blame, because I can't get an appointment with a doctor, so I'll blame immigrants. So there's a narrative like that. But also, like Macron's policies are, while he's more, as I say, he comes over as being a humanitarian, and he actually is quite problematic and... and you have to look at something as well, like, say, it's like the wars, but it's also things like climate change. There's going to be parts of Africa, there's going to be parts of southern Europe that are going to be uninhabitable.
Well, we'll see about that, David. I've heard a lot of warnings about that. So it may be true. David, the one thing I will say is that if Macron really wanted to help people from black Africa and the third world, what he would do is change the European Union's policy where they literally devastate the seas off West Africa with European fleets catching fish in huge quantities. And, of course, we put massive tariffs on vegetables, goods coming from poor African countries. If the EU was sincere, it could do a lot to help Africa. I've seen it do almost nothing. David, I thank you. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here, live on LBC, and it's now 11:15. The issue of immigration is changing Western world politics, and there's a big summit going on in Brussels today. A lot of people saying that, frankly, they've had enough of huge numbers of people coming into their countries. But Macron saying, no, we must do this together as a unified Europe. And please, if you think it would be better for the EU to deal with migration as one bloc and not let, to quote, selfish nationalisms get in the way, then let me know. 10345 6060 973. And what of Trump? Has he got the policies right in America, or is it just too tough? Is it just been too brutal? Before I get to that, interesting. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, she's the White House press spokeswoman. You see her on the screens and hear her on the radio on a very regular basis. Very competent woman. And she found herself on Friday kicked out of a restaurant, the Red Hen restaurant in Lexington, Virginia. And that followed on from Homeland Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, who was having dinner in a Mexican restaurant last week, and a mob came in, this is in Washington, D.C., and started booing and jeering. And it looked to me like Sarah Huckabee Sanders was a bit shocked, actually, at being kicked out of a restaurant. Don't worry, Sarah. There are lots of restaurants, lots of pubs, and lots of coffee bars in Brussels that will not serve me. Why? Because they think I'm actually, in the end, going to bring the whole temple crashing down around their ears, and they'll lose their well-paid jobs. And you know what? Actually, they might just be right. But I've been subject to some of this, and I've had, my children put in a position by so-called democratic protesters that they shouldn't be. And I'm sorry to say, folks, but this is part of the new intolerance. However much those on the right disagree with those on the left, they might send a nasty tweet, they might say something unpleasant, but they don't organise mob rule or violence against them. I'm afraid that there is a new left out there, and it is deeply, deeply intolerant. And what a pleasure it was on Friday. I sat down and did a 10 to 15 minute debate with Ken Clarke. And do you know something? I disagree with Ken completely on the European Union, on the role of the state, on immigration, on grammar schools, on a whole host of things. I disagree completely with Ken Clarke. And yet, do you know something? We had a proper debate and we chatted afterwards. And that's the way democracy should be conducted. We should respect the fact that other people have different points of view. Goodness me, it's what people fought world wars for us to have that freedom. There's too little of it. So, who's getting immigration right? The European Union or Trump? Let's ask Steve in Croydon what he thinks. Good morning.
Good morning, Nigel. It seems ironic to me that we could end up leaving the European Union, we will end up leaving the European Union on the matter of immigration, which I believe was really, in most people's mind, the main reason for the yes vote to leave. And then it could be ironic that we'll end up leaving the European Union just before the European Union decide to deal with immigration in the way that would have been acceptable to the UK. And I don't believe that you can have immigration without integration. And I spent 9 months in Hamburg, and there are parts of Hamburg that are Turkey. They have Turkish flags. Everybody speaks Turkish. It's like being in a different
but Steve, come on. I had this debate with Lord Mandelson during the referendum. I said we've turned vast parts of our, not vast parts, but many of our towns and cities, have got districts within them that are unrecognisable. I was told that these are the benefits by Lord Mandelson of multiculturalism, and that to speak out against that made me a very extreme and bad person.
But was he talking from his gated community of white people, which Tony Blair obviously does?
Yeah, quite. No, I mean, it is a huge issue. Steve, I tell you what, where you're slightly wrong, and that is that the common asylum policy that the European Union, Mr Juncker put into place in 2015, which Merkel reinforced, we were not part of anyway, all right? The issue for us, although those that come into European countries within 4, 5, 6 years get EU passports and could then, as an EU member, have come to Britain, the real issue for us, Steve, I think, even above and beyond that, was the free movement question. And the one thing I can promise you is the European Union would rather disappear in a puff of smoke than give up their principle of the free movement of people. It is not going to be reformed. It is not going to be changed.
I accept that. And a final point from me then would be that Angela Merkel, rather like Tony Blair, stood there and said, I personally, Angela Merkel, I would like to throw the doors open to 1 million people. She did that. But if you had a referendum now in Germany and said, do you want free movement of people? Would that be yes or would that be no?
It'd be a no. But equally, Steve, had there been a referendum in Germany 20 years ago on giving up the Deutschmark for the euro, we know what the result would have been. And in a sense, that is why this AfD movement Steve has got going, is the German people have been ignored by Berlin for far, far, far too long. Thank you, Steve, for your call. Richard thinks that Trump's policy is correct. It's time the European governments ceased their bonkers open-door policy. Well, there is change in the wind, Richard, but exactly where this will go, I don't know. I do actually genuinely begin to think that Merkel simply cannot survive that catastrophic decision that she made. But there we are, we'll see. Charlotte is calling from the Forest of Dean. Good morning, Charlotte.
Good morning, Nigel.
So, who has got the kinder policy? Is it this evil man Trump or the cuddly European Commission?
Well, as you know, because I ring in here regularly. Yeah,
we've spoken before,
I'm a big supporter of the Donald, and I fully support what Trump is saying this week and what he has said about immigration. He's had a pop at Angela Merkel and the disastrous immigration policies, and I think it takes somebody like Trump, who's removed from the European project, to come out and say, look at the disaster that is Europe.
But the optics,
Charlotte, going on over there.
But the optics, Charlotte, of separated children weren't good. You know, I was in New York last week, and it was very interesting. It wasn't just the Democrats saying this looks wrong and feels wrong. Actually, many of his own Republican Party said this looks wrong and feels wrong.
Yes, but it's been a policy that's been in place, and the Democrats brought it in. It's a bit hypocritical, isn't it?
Yeah, funny enough, Charlotte.
Clinton brought it in, Obama brought it in. I mean, who's a hypocrite here?
Funny enough, Charlotte, if a family, including children, try illegally to get into the United Kingdom, you never guess what we do? we would separate the parents and the children. So there was a bit of anti-Trumpism here, and that's why he did change that policy, which is probably the wise thing to do. But what do you think Europe should do, Charlotte? I mean, we've got this human tide coming across the Mediterranean, thousands drowning. What should the European Union do in the face of this?
Well, the European Union aren't going to do anything. If there was anybody with the kahunas of Donald Trump who could stand up and basically say, send them back, turn the boats around and send them back to Libya, and chuck them off and put signs up everywhere saying basically you are not coming into Europe. If you get on a boat and come here, we will turn you away and you will come back. And it would stop. I mean, if we stopped giving, and not only that, the freebies have got to stop, Nigel. The freebies have got to stop. The hand over fist grovelling of giving these people houses over the indigenous population who need housing. And I'm not just talking about the UK, I'm talking about Europe in general. You know, you've got to stop giving these people handouts, because that's why they're coming. You know, they think they're on a free ride here, and this is why so many people are so angry, Nigel.
They are. No, Charlotte, many people are. Thank you. Although Jim says to me, why are Brexit voters all scared of anybody foreign? Trace back through our ancestry, and the majority of us are descended of immigrants. It's all about scale, Jim, isn't it? It's all about scale. You know, I mean, outside of wartime, if you look at the sheer numbers that came to Britain from 1066 until 1997, in sheer numbers, it was tiny compared to what's come here since 1997. And arguably, in some years, there'd been more people coming into the United Kingdom that had come in all the previous centuries added up together. So it is very much about scale. Trump is right for a major reason. The president's first duty is to protect his people. That's not what the EU's been doing, and they've been putting their people in harm's way. All of those attacks, France, Germany, the UK, come to mind, says Chris. Well, you know, the one thing I think that is changing politics is the fact that of those 8 men who committed those barbarous atrocities in Paris a few years ago, 5 of them had come back into the European continent posing as migrants, and that is fundamentally changing politics. I think what the European Union needs to do is to say, look, we will give genuine refugee status to those who qualify. You know, because when you see that 70% of those that are coming are young men between 18 and 30, frankly, most of them wouldn't qualify as refugees. We will give refugee status to some people, but all of this will be processed outside the European Union. And that, I think, if they did that, then possibly the drownings would end. But at the moment, thousands of people are drowning every year, and effectively, we're all just turning a blind eye to it, which I find quite remarkable. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It is now 11:30, and it's very difficult for any government to win when it comes to dealing with illegal immigration, who should be allowed to stay, who is a refugee, who isn't. Trump has got big battles with it on the Mexican border, and the European Union, boy, have certainly got it with those that have been crossing the Mediterranean for the last few years. And I'm asking, who has got the best approach? The European Union or Donald Trump? Before that, you know, whenever you hear the SAS, it conjures up these amazing stories, you know, and one thinks of the Andy McNabb books, and very often people use the SAS as an analogy for something. Who dares wins, and they are a completely extraordinary elite unit. They were founded back in the desert by an eccentric called David Sterling, who had this idea. He'd get a sort of group of irregulars together who would go long distances across the desert and blow up aeroplanes, and on that went. David Sterling led it. It was then taken over by a guy called Paddy Mayne, one of the most decorated soldiers in all of history. And I'd naturally assumed that this tiny group of people who'd got together in 1942 were all dead. But one of them's still alive. His name is Mike Sadler. There, right from the very start, fought through some amazing, incredible battles. And he was made on Friday a Chevalier of the Légion d'Honneur in France. And I reckon that's pretty remarkable that there is just one person left from the SAS. And you know what? What was it all for? Free speech and debate, and accepting that other people have different points of view without getting too upset about it. Analia is calling me from Clapton. Good morning.
Hello, Nigel. How are you?
I'm very well. So, have the European... Is the EU doing the right thing in accepting people who come across the Mediterranean?
No, in my opinion, there is no perfect situation on either side.
No, there isn't.
And however, I massively disagree with what is happening with the United States to the point where, this is beyond belief. That's my opinion. Because
what do you disagree with, particularly?
Well, my main concern is that as a result of this policy, and whoever before was talking to you saying that this policy was in place even before with the Obama administration. The policy was in place. However, the main difference is that this policy was not applied up to the point where it was only applied when obviously you have a convict or criminal crossing the border. This is the main difference.
Yes. What they've done is they're basically saying in America now, as part of their zero tolerance policy, that anyone who crosses the border without the right paperwork is themselves a criminal.
Absolutely, and that's the main difference. But crossing the border on its own is not a felony. It's not a misdemeanor. And at the moment, every single family is treated in the same way. This is, to me, this is absolutely unacceptable. And there are more clever ways to deal with this influx of immigration. There are many rural parts of America where immigrants could be placed. They could work on land. They can work on agriculture, or I'm sure there are many things that could be thought of.
But I would say this to you. The estimates are. Who knows with estimates? But the estimates are there are between 10 and 20 million illegal immigrants in America. And isn't the point here that people being allowed to come into America illegally and work, etc., isn't that grossly unfair to the tens of millions of people who've gone into America, gone through the hoops and done the whole thing legally? Isn't it unfair to them, including many Mexicans?
Well, that's a good point, because then in this case, I think it should be looked at how people were dealt with previously, and if this was done correctly, at a certain point, this is the way that it should be dealt now at the moment. Obviously, immigration is a difficult issue, but I watched the protest of the Senate the other night, and there were absolutely horrible examples of every single case. These people have been there in place, they visited the facilities, and the things that are coming out at the moment are absolutely horrendous. For anyone who is listening, that my main concern as a result of this policy is that children who have been staying in the facilities for a long time, at some point they're offered for adoption, or they're offered to the so-called sponsors, who are people absolutely unknown, who they're saying, oh, we've tested these people, they're fine to take the children away. Who are these sponsors? This creates a perfect situation for human trafficking. A lot of these children will be able to be traced back.
That may be true, but where we have human trafficking on an industrial scale are the people coming across from Libya.
Well, I would not put anyone under the same line. Similarly, a lot of Syrian refugees were placed, for example, in Italy. There were towns that they had which were less populated, and there were certain people that were able to find a place for them. So maybe this should be looked at in a more clever way. The U.S. is a vast territory. I'm not saying that every single person should be placed, but I would rather have a whole family deported together rather than break a family and take a child away.
And isn't that why, Analia, Trump listened and changed policy this week?
He has not changed the policy. The policy, actually, if you obviously you are aware of a lot of things, the policy has not been changed for good. What he said just the other day is that this is just a temporary solution, and the families would not be, the policy would not be indefinite. So the policy has not been reversed 100% completely. He said that also there will be no guarantee for the children who have already been separated. There is no guarantee that they will be reunited 100% with their parents. The American Pediatric Association stated that such a separation can have lifelong effects.
So why did the parents put their children through all this risk?
I don't think anyone has expected the scale of that. People have not been at the legal entry points at the border. People have not been even allowed to get to the bridge crossing. They've been returned numerous times away, where say, okay, if you cross the border illegally, then we apply this policy to you. But actually, this happens exactly to people who are crossing the border illegally, and they're lawfully asking for entry.
I tell you what, Analia, this issue's not going away, is it? It really isn't. Listen, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts. Something I agree with very strongly here on Twitter. In World War II, it was all done properly. Women and children only evacuated to return when safe to do so. The men stayed and fought. Today, perversely, we see 70% plus male migrants coming in with far fewer of the truly vulnerable women and children. Very wrong indeed. I, very controversially, to some, in the referendum, used that big poster of the line of people rushing to get in to answer Merkel's call, saying the EU has failed us all. And you look at that picture, there weren't many women, there weren't any children, there weren't any old people. That is what's been happening. James is calling from New Zealand. Is it Kataya? Is that how I pronounce it, James?
Yes, Nigel, yes, it's Qatar.
Qatar. Well, good morning. Give us a view from completely the other side of the world.
Well, it's a bit of irony here. I live in a country that's an island, and it actually has quite strong immigration controls.
Yes.
And we've already got a Labour government in control at the moment, which is actually cutting down the number of migrants coming to the country. So it's a little bit different here.
Yes, well, of course, but you've also got Winston Peters, haven't you, in that coalition, who very much like Trump's America First takes a New Zealand First approach, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to Winnie and spoke about you actually, Nigel. But yes, but Labour in its own manifesto was actually going to bring down that, and that was because I think over here politicians, unlike the UK, are a bit more in touch with the average person.
So if I landed, James, if I landed illegally in New Zealand on a boat that had come from... I have to have travelled a fair way, I grant you, but if I landed illegally in New Zealand, what would happen to me?
Well, you wouldn't probably get too far. You would get caught and detained, and then they would be taking you away pretty much to where it came from.
Yeah, I guess so. So when you look at the way the European Union are handling their Mediterranean crisis and the way that Trump is handling the Mexican crisis, who's got it right, who's got it wrong? Are they both wrong?
Yeah, actually, I think they're both wrong. With the EU, they've got no clue. And I think that again goes to the fact that they've got they're not in touch with the rest of people in Europe and Europeans. And you can see that with the rise of all these different parties that are actually anti-immigration. Mm-hmm. I think with Trump, what we got is he's doing a knee-jerk reaction, which is to start closing up the borders. And I totally agree with that, because if you've got a lot of people coming in which are causing high levels of crime, of course, it's the principle of any government is to look after and defend its people. Yeah. And at the end of the day, anyone that doesn't close for them line is a criminal, and they should be dealt with that. Well,
that's the approach the Americans are taking, James. It's led to great controversy, although I suspect, amongst Trump's voters in Middle America, they might not have liked the pictures they've seen this week, but they will agree with the principle. 70% of Americans want the US government to get tough on illegal immigration. James from Qatar in New Zealand, thank you for your call. I'll be in New Zealand later in this year. OK, we'll keep your calls going on immigration. But what a day. It's a heat wave, and I think it could go on for a bit. And we did talk a month or two ago, when the snow was down in March, about what the prospects could be for a barbecue summer. So we're going to get John Ketley on after the break to get him to make weather predictions, barbecue predictions, ahead of the England football match. And I'll warn him now, I'm even going to ask him how the football's going to go. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here at LBC, and it's now 11:45. A crisis meeting in Brussels today by the European Union ahead of a summit coming up on Thursday. And, it has to be said, President Merkel in Germany, her position now very, very vulnerable. Immigration, a hot topic, both in Europe and, of course, in the USA, where Trump has come under great criticism this week. And you may well today be talking about such things, but I'm guessing I'm guessing the main subject of conversation so far this morning has been the weather, because it's really rather lovely out there. It looks a bit like Heatwave Sunday and set, I think, for a few days to continue. And, you know, are you going to barbecues this afternoon? The pubs, by the way, are predicting possibly record takings during the England football game against Panama today. Let's go to weather forecaster, legendary weather forecaster, John Ketley. Good morning, John.
Yes, good morning, Nigel.
Now, it must have been the summer solstice at Stonehenge must have been amazing this year.
Yes, it's just really turning out to be a pretty good summer so far, isn't it? You know, technically we do talk about summer as being statistically the 1st of June to the end of August, but it's nice when you get the nicer weather earlier on than that, and we all remember, don't we? We spoke, I think, at length about the warm weather that came along during April, and then that hottest May Day bank holiday on the 7th of May.
That's right. It's been actually remarkable. And I noticed after what was a very wet winter, the grass was growing like billio, and suddenly the lawns are looking a little bit browner. It's been pretty dry this month,
yeah,
isn't it?
What's bothering me, Nigel, is that because of all that moisture that we did have, and then the heat suddenly arrives, we've seemed to be getting a lot of mosquitoes in my garden. It's biting me to death.
Yes.
So that's a downside of all this sort of weather, and it doesn't take long before temperatures start to soar, and then we start to get more humid and more sultry, oppressive weather, and that's probably what's going to happen in various parts of the UK in this coming 7 to 10 days. So the hot weather is certainly driving in at the moment. The highest temperature recently was Bournemouth, 23 degrees, but a few places will get 25, 26 degrees as we go through today. And then as the week goes on, different parts of the country will see exceptional temperatures, probably up to 28 to 30. Not everywhere and not at the same time, because one of the things that does happen when you get fairly light winds, you do get these sea breezes developing around some coasts onshore, which just spoils things a little bit. But you hear the television weatherman or lady saying those refreshing breezes. Well, actually, it can feel quite chilly. So you've got to be careful what you say when you're doing broadcasting like that.
So we've got a barbecue summer coming up for the next 7 to 10 days, and any thoughts thereafter?
Well, you know, we did talk last time about when the barbecue would be, and I said the barbecue summer would be around about Wimbledon fortnight. I'm not changing from that. I think the hottest weather at the moment is definitely lined up for this next 7 to 10 days. It may turn cooler, and there may be some showery weather during July, but at the moment, you know, I think we should just enjoy the fact that it is turning out to be a pretty warm spell of weather we're having in most parts of the country. Yeah,
it really is. And John, England v Panama this afternoon. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's be hot. 31 degrees is the top temperature, and you don't want me to put my neck out any further than that, do you? I mean,
you spent your life putting your neck out.
Well, I have.
And being praised and being criticised. So go on, give it a go. What's the score going to be?
Well, I've got away with it for all these years, so I'll get away with it one more time. Despite the fact that it'll be very hot for the England boys, I think temperatures, the scoreline will be round about 2-0. I'd be very happy with 2-0. And I might just throw this at you. There are thunderstorms rolling around the different parts of Russia at the moment. They're not hitting the ground, generally speaking, but I think there will be some hotter weather coming in for the next match on Thursday, which will be against Belgium.
Yep.
And I think thunderstorms are certainly on the cards for that one.
Terrific. John Ketley, thank you very much indeed. Well, wasn't I cruel there to ask him to forecast what the football would be as well as just the weather? But hey, 7 to 10 days of great weather coming up. If you can, take advantage of it and enjoy it, because my experience of the last few Augusts is when all the kids are off, it tends to be wet and windy. Back to this serious, vexed issue of migration. Who's got the right approach, the EU or the Americans? Vicky from Brighton is my next caller. Hello.
Oh, hello. Good morning, Nigel.
Good morning.
Ignorant Brexiteer here.
Oh, gosh. And are you a bit racist as well, Vicky?
Well, I've been called that, but I certainly am not.
No, thank you.
The point I wanted to make, Nigel, is simply this. I'm not talking about genuine refugees trying to get into Europe. The world has always been compassionate and hopefully will continue to do so, and this country has always been very generous. I'm talking about really, economic migrants. And frankly, the EU have only got themselves to blame, because for the last 20, 30, 40 years, through the common agricultural policy or whatever, they have shoved tariffs to anybody not in the EU. And, of course, the main export from poorer countries will tend to be fruit, vegetables, this kind of stuff. So basically, they have kept these countries poor.
Yes, and Vicky, let me just add to that under the common fisheries policies, there are a series of fisheries partnerships where they basically bribe very, very poor African countries, particularly off the west coast of Africa, to go and catch their fish in huge industrial quantities.
To sell their rights. It's absolutely appalling. So basically, you can't blame these people who come from very poor economies and so on and so forth trying to do it. But the EU have only got themselves to blame. And am I not right in saying, Nigel, that if we, after we leave the EU, have a free trade policy with countries like this, we lose nothing. We gain a lot because these products will be cheaper in our supermarkets because the tariffs that are currently charged for these countries go straight to Brussels anyway.
Vicky, slightly separate debate, but if we wanted to, we could make bras, shoes, underwear, food, fruit, cut flowers. We could make all of those things a lot cheaper. The only difficulty would be we'd have our own farming community and producers to think about and deal with as well. But if we wanted to, Brexit could make the shopping basket for a family on the average wage they'd be a lot better off if we took advantage. But I fear we're a long way from that. What is ironic, Vicky, is that immigration was one of the main drivers of the Brexit vote, and here we've got emergency summits in Brussels, Trump in the middle of a storm in America, and in this country, the government doesn't even want to discuss immigration.
Well, I just poor, and frankly, Mrs. Merkel, arrogantly, because she was so beholden, because she thinks she just runs Europe and tells Europe what to do, just took it on herself to say what she did 2 years ago.
Well, I think it was based on guilt, Vicky. I think there is still, amongst many German people, it's changing, but amongst many German people, there is still a tremendous sense of guilt about what happened 75 years ago. It hasn't gone away. And, by the way, I'm not suggesting for one moment people should forget what happened 75 years ago, but I do think her decision was based on guilt and wanting to look good on the international stage. It wasn't based on rationale. It wasn't based on logic. And between her and Mr. Juncker, they have, and I'm going to say this, they have directly led their policy to the deaths of thousands of people in the Mediterranean. Vicky, I thank you. We're going to stay in Brighton, but we're going to go to Stephen. Stephen, hello, good morning.
Hello, Nigel. Nice to speak to you.
Good to speak to you. So, who's got this right? Who's got it wrong?
Well, you've just been discussing Angela Merkel. I think it was actually quite a calculated decision. Inviting so many people meant the richest, the healthiest, the brainiest are the people who would get to Germany first. And it's actually the more disadvantaged that would struggle. And those are the ones primarily who probably lost their lives. Whereas for Germany, it's wonderful for them. They're getting the richest and the brightest.
I mean, Stephen, I understand your point. I understand your point that, yes, the healthiest certainly are the ones that would get through, and the most ambitious are the ones that would get through. But isn't there, Stephen, a massive cultural problem here? Don't a lot of these young men come from countries in which women are at best second-class citizens, and hasn't the rise in assaults against women and everything else turned the population against this policy?
Well, I don't know about that because I don't live in Germany and I'm a bit distrusting of the media.
Certainly what happened, Stephen, what happened outside Cologne train station a couple of New Year's Eves ago was seen as an outrage. And there's a similar thing that's happened in Sweden with Malmö, city of Malmö, having a massive rise in these kinds of crimes. The problem, and you're right to say these are ambitious young people, but they've come in effectively as refugees when hardly any of them, Stephen, would qualify genuinely as refugees. And I think it's left a big cultural problem. Stephen, I think I've quickly got time for Norman, who's calling from Dover, my last call of the morning. Good morning, Norman.
Good morning, Nigel. Very pleasure to speak to you this morning.
Good to have you on.
My comment is that European Union has been passing the buck as far as these migrants are concerned. They've been shifting them to northern France. Nobody wants them throughout Europe, and they end up congregating in the coastal towns of northern Europe, and they should be stopped at the border before they actually enter the European Union.
Yes, I mean, Calais is a knock-on consequence, is it not, of the policies we've got over the Mediterranean. Do you know, Norman, I sit next to Juncker. I gave 2 speeches in 2015 as he was launching this policy, saying it would be a disaster, saying that it would lead to deaths in the Mediterranean. He wasn't up for listening. Norman, I thank you. I thank everybody. I'll be back tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. This afternoon at 3, Ian Payne's in for Andrew Castle, but up now, it's Majid Nawaz.
Thank you, Nigel. Enjoy the game while I'm stuck here.